Uh, I'm Dimitris Anastasiou, Associate Professor in Special Education Program at the School of Education at Southern Illinois University Carbondale. Out of courtesy to the guest speaker, I will speak in English today. First of all, I would like to warmly thank the Greek Primary Teachers Federation for the invitation to be the moderator of today's discussion. During the presentation of Professor Brian Cook, you can submit your written questions in a Google Docs form. And after his presentation,
Recording in progress.
The questions in Greek will be translated by me and delivered to the speaker. Unfortunately, this event is being held in the shadow of a tragic time for Greece. I refer to Tempe Valley's horrible train crash with 57 people killed in the deadliest rail tragedy in Greek history. I know people in Greece still mourn and reflect. They also claim this gives us some hope in these dark times. The struggle of the Primary Teachers Federation, which fights for free and public education and better education for children with and without disabilities, also gives hope to many teachers, students, and parents. Hope and knowledge, truth and justice can go together. Today, I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Professor Brian Cook. A few words about him. Brian G. Cook is a professor in the Special Education Program at the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia. He has devoted much of his career to identifying and disseminating evidence-based practices and examining the research to practice gap in special education. He has many widely read and well-cited publications on these issues and is widely recognized as a leader in this crucial area of research. He also is a leading expert for open science in special education. This is currently his new passion, focusing on making publications, materials, and data available to all in the educational community. He served as chair of the Council for Exceptional Children, a work group on evidence-based practices, which developed CEC standards for evidence-based practices in special education. To clarify here, CEC is the largest professional organization focusing on the education of children with disabilities. Additionally, Brian is past president of CEC's Division for Research, former co-editor of the journal Behavioral Disorders, co-editor of the annual volume Advances in Learning and Behavioral Disorders, and associate editor for 3 major journals in special education, exceptional children, remedial and special education, and behavioral disorders. He was recently recognized with the Leadership Award from CEC's Division for Emotional and Behavioral Health. Brian Cook will be sharing with us his insights on evidence-based teaching practices and the future of special and inclusive education. This is our topic today. I'm sure his presentation will be informative and inspiring. Stay tuned to learn more about it. At this point, I would like to give a warm welcome to Professor Brian Cook. I think this is the first time that he addresses a Greek audience. Am I right, Brian?
Yes, I believe that's correct. Thank you very much, Dimitris. I very much appreciate the introduction, and I am pleased and honored to be talking with you today. So will we have a translator in real time, or will it just be translated after the fact?
I think we have a translator in real time.
Okay.
This is my impression.
That's what I thought too. I'm just not hearing it. But maybe when we start the presentation. So I'm pleased to talk with you today about evidence-based teaching evidence-based practices, which is a movement in education that has had a lot of influence in the United States, where I teach and work, and I would say it's resulted in a moderate level of success in the field, and so we'll go over some of the issues around evidence-based, or sometimes I like to say evidence-informed education in the field. As a preview, then we'll talk about why we might consider evidence-based education. I'll talk about some specifics about what evidence-based education is. We'll go over some terms. I'll talk about different sources of evidence-based practices. I'll give a preview of some different practices that have been identified as evidence-based in education, and especially in my field of special education. I'll talk a little bit about what EBPs are not. I think that's important. And then we'll end with how we can go about implementing and sustaining the effective use of evidence-based practices. And I'm pausing to see if there'll be translation, but I'm not hearing any. So.
Sir, there is translation. I am the translator. But I speaking in Greek.
I think they are translating during your presentation in real time.
Okay, so I should pause at the end of each.
You don't need to do that. Just
okay, maybe just a short pause. Okay.
Excuse me, Mr. Cook. There is a
Yes.
translation. There is interpretation. You have to choose the interpretation by the interpretation button. Have you chose English?
I'm not sure where the interpretation button is.
It's at the bottom of the screen.
After record.
Got it. More. And so, okay.
Thank you. As long as Mr. Anastasiou is talking to you in English, you won't hear the interpreter.
Got it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, so we will start with why we might focus on evidence-based or evidence-informed education and use evidence-based practices. Education has been around for a very long time, and teachers have been making decisions without formal research evidence. And I would guess that continues to be the case for most teachers most of the time. Teachers make lots of different decisions throughout the course of the day, and they do so based on many different sources for decision making. I would estimate the primary source of decision-making is personal experience. This has happened to me before. Perhaps this is how I was taught. This is what has worked for me in the past. Personal experience, and humans are very good at making decisions based on personal experience. We also look to experts, such as textbooks, such as professors, and providers of professional development. We certainly also look to colleagues. Colleagues are doing the same work that we do, and we can extend our personal experience based on the experiences of our colleagues. And we also have a rich set of tradition and traditional practices in education, where teachers that came before us have established practices that are used in the field. These are all rich sources of decision-making and can provide a lot of good guidance. However, they're all prone to error sometimes, and they're all based in one way or another on personal experience. And humans are very good at interpreting their experience and making decisions based on that. But we're also subject to many different types of cognitive biases. And one way we can think about this is that we fool ourselves very often. I know I fool myself all the time. And there's lots of different anecdotes about, we tend to pay attention to things that confirm our prior beliefs, and we tend to ignore information that doesn't align with our prior beliefs. And once a belief is well established, sometimes it's very hard to change that. And so as much as, well, I think I'll get to my next slide here. Just like experts in other fields, teachers are experts in teaching, but and as much as they form correct opinions, oftentimes we're not always correct. Sometimes we form, we act on, and we cling to invalid beliefs based on our limited personal experience. And so just one of many of these types of research studies, a 0.63 correlation, which is a relatively strong, but yet a moderate correlation between teachers' beliefs about their students' achievement levels and then the actual achievement levels of those students across 12 different studies. So a meta-analysis of different studies showed a moderate to strong correlation, which indicates that teachers really know their students most of the time, but sometimes they're a little bit off about their students' actual performance, and occasionally they're quite a bit off and misjudge. And I think we do the same thing when we, as teachers, kind of make up our minds about what works or what we should use in terms of instructional practices. A lot of times we're right when using personal experience, talking to colleagues, consulting experts, but sometimes we're off quite a bit. And when we're incorrect, this is a high stakes game for students. We want to, obviously, as educators, be using the most effective instructional practices that are available to us. And so one alternative we have to these other ways of knowing is research evidence. So using approaches like personal experience and relying on colleagues has resulted, or it's one of the things that has helped to produce a research to practice gap, where we see a gap between what the research evidence says and what goes on in typical practice, in typical classrooms. And there's lots of examples about this. And there are many, many examples in my field of special education of questionable practices being used, practices that don't have strong evidence of being effective. And so and I don't know how much this is true in Greece, but learning styles is very popular in the US. Very often teachers will assess the learning styles of students. Are they visual learners? Are they auditory learners? Are students kinesthetic learners? Do they learn by touching and feeling things? And then try to, there are different assessments to try to determine what type of learner a student is. And then teachers will try to teach to students in those ways. There's lots of research that shows that that isn't effective. That doesn't improve student learning by assessing and trying to teach to students' learning styles. There is, by the way, and I will make my the PowerPoint slides available to you. There are hyperlinks to different resources for a lot of the things that are in my in the PowerPoint slides. So in addition to sometimes using things that aren't very effective, we oftentimes in classes rarely use things that have been shown to be effective. And one of the examples I use for that is behavior-specific praise. And so when students engage in a behavior such as being on task and engaged with their work, we give prompt and specific praise. We let them know what they're doing right, and we tell them about that to reinforce that. And yet, even for students with disabilities, even for students with emotional and behavioral disorders, observational research tells us that that just doesn't happen very often in classes, even though we have a lot of research that shows that it's effective, and even though that's a fairly easy practice to engage in. And so we have this ongoing research to practice gap in the field, and it's not specific to education. I think a lot of what I'm talking about today isn't particularly specific to education, that this research to practice gap exists in medicine, in lots of other fields. In medicine, they sometimes refer to it as the bench to bedside gap. So the gap between research found by conducting laboratory research on a bench versus the bedside practice of a medical doctor. This evidence-based movement actually originated in medicine, but is being applied now in other fields like education. So scientific research is where the evidence-based movement and advocates of evidence-based practice suggest that we use scientifically based research to inform our practices. I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that scientific research is perfect. Scientific research is flawed as well. The claim and the hope is that very strong experimental research is, even though potentially flawed, is a more valid, less flawed approach for determining what works than personal experience and talking to colleagues and other approaches that we use to inform historically, that we've used to inform our practice. And so going back to the quote I shared earlier, I think of science as a protection against fooling ourselves. It's not a perfect protection, but it's better protection than other approaches. So evidence-based practices, these are practices that have been shown by high-quality research to improve student learning. What are these practices? How do we identify them? What terms might you encounter out there around evidence-based practices and related practices? So I'll start off with terminology. And there's lots of different practices or lots of different terms that you may hear in this area. And it can get confusing, especially because many people use terminology pretty loosely, and it is, or imprecisely. And sometimes it's hard to tell how people are using these terms. If you're not sure, I just encourage you, whether it is a professor or a colleague, and they talk about research-based practices or best practices, evidence-based practices, I would encourage you to ask them, what do you mean by that? So I'll go over each of these practices here. I know I've seen best or recommended practice used a lot in the field of education, and my field, special education. And it always stood out to me. It is intended to mean a practice that is effective and is recommended, but it doesn't specify on what basis it is recommended, on what criteria it is deemed best. And so it isn't necessarily based on research evidence. It doesn't mean that best practices can't be evidence-based. They might be, but when you hear someone talking about best practice, I'm always interested, is there research to support that practice? There might be, there might not be. And I think it's important to try to find out whether we have solid research to support a practice as being effective. Another term that I see more and more in recent years is high leverage practices. High leverage practices to me are similar to best practices, but these are usually determined by teams of experts in the field, and they generally refer to some very basic foundational teaching practices that all teachers should know, such as collaborating with other professionals, using student assessment data, establishing a consistent, organized, respectful learning environment in your class. These are things that basically all teachers should know. For different reasons, they are hard to research in some ways. They may not be evidence-based per se, but they oftentimes are used in conjunction with evidence-based practices. So they overlap with evidence-based practices, but oftentimes they don't have, because they are these core practices that are often used in conjunction with other practices, there may not be research to support their effectiveness as independent, separate practices, but they're generally agreed upon skills that teachers should have. Research-based practices. So I think this was more popular in the US a couple of decades ago, and it recognizes the importance of research in determining the effectiveness of practices, and it suggests that research is important. It is just not a well-defined term, and it just suggests that there is some research to support a given practice, but it doesn't say what kind of research, from how many studies. There aren't necessarily criteria about the quality of the research that supports a practice. And if I want to find some research out there supporting a practice, I can probably find some research to support just about any practice. So I as much as research-based practice, that term suggests that there's some research out to support a practice, which is great. I want to know how much and what type of research supports a practice as well, for me to have full confidence in it. And so that leads us to evidence-based practices. which in these slides I will abbreviate as EBP. Evidence-based practice is kind of a semi-formal term, at least is how I'm using it, that suggests a practice is supported not just by some research somewhere, but by multiple high-quality experimental studies that show that the practice or intervention has positive effects on outcomes for a group of learners. I think, and we'll get into more specifics here shortly, but I think evidence-based practices can be beneficial to use for all learners. But I think perhaps it is especially important to use highly effective evidence-based instructional approaches for students with disabilities and at-risk learners, because they really need that highly effective instruction to reach their goals. So over the last couple of decades, there are lots of different groups, some in special education, some in education more broadly in the US, that have come up with very specific criteria for how much and what type of research must support a practice for the practice to be identified as an evidence-based practice. I was involved in developing this last one here, the Council for Exceptional Children. I think this is interesting, perhaps frustrating in some ways. They all pose similar criteria. They all have similar standards, but they're all a little bit different too. And I suppose it is reasonable that different groups of educators would have different thoughts on how much and what types of research are necessary for a practice to be considered evidence-based, but it is potentially confusing to see different sets of standards being applied that potentially could lead to different recommendations. But for I don't want to get into the specifics of the different criteria and standards here today, but as I'll illustrate in the next couple of slides, these different sets of standards are generally very similar, and they all suggest that, or they all have criteria suggesting that studies must be of high quality. We're only looking at experimental studies that show that the practice causes, not just is associated with, but causes improved outcomes in students. And those studies have to show, these multiple studies have to show positive effects on student learning outcomes. And so this is a slide on research design, which we don't need to get into too much detail, but the idea is we're really looking at experimental research designs from which we can infer causality. And the idea, not just that a practice is associated with higher outcomes, but that a practice causes improved outcomes. The studies have to meet what are oftentimes called quality indicators. So there is a set of indicators of high quality studies, because research isn't perfect. And so we want to be only looking at the highest quality studies when we determine what works in education. And because no study, even high quality studies, is perfect, not even, we want to be very careful and to be most confident that a practice works. We want to have multiple studies, multiple high quality experimental studies show that a practice works. This is the different areas of quality indicators that the standards that I was involved developing have. We don't need to go over those. I just put this up to show you that there's many different considerations that studies must meet to be considered when identifying evidence-based practice. And these are the standards for the numbers. And so for a randomized group experiment, there has to be two studies. You could argue that there should be more. Maybe 2 is too many. That 2 isn't a magic number, but it shows that multiple high-quality group experiments have shown a practice works for a practice to be considered evidence-based. If you don't randomly assign, you need 4 studies. For single case studies, which involve fewer number of students, you need 5 studies. It also suggests that there should be no studies showing that the practice does harm or has negative effects as well. So I don't want to spend a lot of time going over this, but I want to give you some ideas on what evidence-based practices are and where you can find some of them. So What Works Clearinghouse has been funded with a lot of money by the US federal government. And starting in the early 2000s, there was a real effort to, in the US, to focus on, to identify and to support the implementation of evidence-based practice. And so this is a federally funded clearinghouse that conducted independent reviews of the research and classified how much research support practices had for being effective. And the highest rating they call practices having or shown to have positive effects. And there are lots of other classifications, including potentially positive effects. There isn't much research, but there's a little high quality research showing that a practice works for a practice to be classified as having potentially positive effects. Practices that have positive effects, multiple high quality experimental studies support it as being effective. This is just a screenshot of the What Works Clearinghouse website. You can search for different areas of education. It is frankly not the most user-friendly site. I'm not going to go over these practices in any detail. That's not the point of this presentation, but I wanted to put them on the slide so you can refer to them and go back and look at them later if you'd like to. These are all of the practices that the What Works Clearinghouse has identified as having positive effects. That's their own term. It is a synonym or means the same thing as an evidence-based practice. The What Works Clearinghouse tends to evaluate programs or curricula. And so a lot of these are commercially available programs. I'll leave that up for a second. Here is another list of evidence-based practices. And you'll notice that there is a particular program or practice, and it is evidence-based for a particular outcome and for a particular group of students. That's generally how evidence-based practices are researched and presented. Again, I'll leave those up for just 1 second and then move to the next area. So, and you see that there are different practices for effective for reading achievement, for alphabetics, for social emotional development, for staying in school. So there is a range of these different programs that have been identified as being generally effective for learners at different grade levels. Another set of evidence-based practices identified by What Works Clearinghouse, and then the last couple. And I just didn't want to put them up because it would take me too much time to write it all down and too many slides, but there are even more practices that don't have the highest level of evidence to support them, but they have some level of evidence to support them that are identified by the What Works Clearinghouse as potentially having potentially positive effects. The What Works Clearinghouse provides some additional resources. They don't honestly have a lot of resources to support implementing these recommended practices, but they do provide some resources, including these snapshots where they give you some graphical information on the effectiveness of the practice, the number of studies that met their quality indicators, the racial and ethnic composition of the students in those studies, and other information about the research participants in those studies, which is nice to know. I'm going to briefly go over, with my eye on the time here, a couple of other sources for evidence-based practice in Dr. Anastasio and my field of special education. The area of autism has a big focus on evidence-based practice. There are a lot of questionable and unproven practices that become popular for students with autism. And so there are many scholars in the field that really want to emphasize we need strong research to support and inform what we're teaching students with autism. And so I'm going to just show you two different sources of evidence-based practice in the area of autism. One is a federally funded national clearinghouse in the United States. They've reviewed research from 1990 to 2017 and identified 28 evidence-based practices. And these are broad practices. And then within that, 10 specific manualized interventions. And they also have, similar to the What Works Clearinghouse practices having potentially positive effects, they identified 11 additional practices that have some evidence to support them. Again, we're not going to go into this in a lot of depth, but a couple slides on the specific evidence-based practices that the National Clearinghouse has identified as being evidence-based, again, supported by multiple high-quality experimental studies as being effective for students with autism. The remaining evidence-based practices. These are the 10 or the 11 manualized interventions. And so these are specific programs with manuals that teachers can use to implement them that fall under the broader areas of evidence-based practice. But these are more like the programs that were featured in the What Works Clearinghouse. One of the things that I really like about the evidence-based practices from that National Clearinghouse is that they have modules, what they call AFFIRM modules, or autism-focused intervention resources and modules that you can register for, and they have videos and implementation checklists, and they have different resources that will help teachers implement these practices. And those are, they spend a lot of time and money putting these together, and I think those are really important resources for teachers. So I think it's one of the strengths of that source of information on evidence-based practices. And this is just a screenshot of one of those modules that it breaks down each evidence-based practice into different lessons where they have an accompanying video on different elements of the practice and how to implement it. One of the other things that I like about this source is that they break down, and these are all abbreviations, but these are the evidence-based practices here. and then they tell you where there is research evidence for what areas of outcomes, and then for different age ranges. So you can see some of these, there's lots of support for different evidence-based practices in different areas, but not so much in other areas. And it's important to know that. And they have a nice graphic for that. I'll just briefly look at this because it's very similar to the last resource, but there's another independent private group, the National Autism Center, that has reviewed the research on autism on their own and identified what they call established practices, 14 established practices, which is a synonym for evidence-based practice. They're established practices, again, high quality, multiple high quality experimental studies that show these practices as being effective for learners with autism. And so you can go to this website that I have linked on the previous slide, and you can download their report. They're actually currently engaged in updating that their literature review. And so they should have a new phase with some updates to that real soon. You can see that that's their phase 3 here. So here there are 14 established practices for learners ages 0 to 21. And they also have some additional resources. They don't have the learning modules like we saw with the last resource, but in their report, they do have some additional information on each of the evidence-based practices. And then one last resource on evidence-based practices to point out. There are lots of independent researchers and research teams that are applying these different sets of standards to identify evidence-based practices that are often published in professional journals. And so these are just a couple of different journals out there. We, my colleagues and I conducted a review of these, what I call evidence-based reviews. To summarize them, we're currently updating that review. If you're interested, contact me. Hopefully by the end of this calendar year, we will have a list of these independent reviews. I'm not going to really pause and talk about them, but I'll just I'm hearing the translation now for some reason. So these are different independent reviews that used different evidence-based standards. And so these are some evidence-based practices. What Works Clearinghouse standards. So I don't know what happened that I'm now hearing the translation. And hopefully that's not providing feedback on your end. It's okay on my end. Some additional evidence-based practices that independent researchers have identified using the What Works Clearinghouse standards. A set of standards that were developed by Russell Gersten and his colleagues. Some additional evidence-based practices have been identified. Lots of evidence-based practices identified using a set of standards developed by Rob Horner and his colleagues. And again, we won't pause to talk about them now, but I encourage you to go back and look at those and go look at the articles for more details on your own. The Council for Exceptional Children standards are being used with more and more often in recent years. So here are some evidence-based practices that have been identified using those standards. Brian Riekow and his colleagues came up with a different set of standards, and they are used not as often, but some, to identify evidence-based practices. And as I'll talk about as we finish up, there are more and more high quality experimental studies being conducted in education. And there are more and more reviews being done of that research to identify evidence-based practices. But there's still a limited number of evidence-based practices. There's just not enough evidence-based practices that we can use for every situation in every classroom. And so some scholars in this area use a term that I like a lot. We should be guided by the best available evidence. So we're not going to have enough evidence to identify everything that we might use as evidence-based practice. If we can find an evidence-based practice that fits our needs, that's fantastic. We can have a lot of confidence that is likely to be effective, but we're not always going to have that available. And so then we have to think about what is the kind of the next best available evidence that we might look to support a practice as being probably effective. We can look at those promising practices or those research-based practices. So they haven't been identified as EBPs yet, but there is meaningful research to support their effectiveness. We might look at EBPs for related groups of learners. So I'm not teaching kids with autism maybe, but I found this evidence-based practice for students with autism because that's an area where they do a lot of work identifying evidence-based practices. I might want to try that. A practice that works for one group of learners has a good chance of working for another group of learners, even though it might not necessarily. We can also look at other sources of evidence to identify practices that are likely effective. And ideally, we want to identify studies that are supported as effective from multiple studies. And we can look at meta-analyses and reviews of literature instead of us independently having to go find multiple studies. If we find a meta-analysis or a systematic review of the literature, somebody's already looked at, compiled that evidence and analyzed evidence across multiple studies. And so some resources for research-based and promising practices. There are links here. What Works Clearinghouse publishes these practice guides that I think are actually quite good. There are some other resources here they don't apply evidence-based criteria per se, but they make research-based recommendations on practices that are supported by research. Meta-analyses, that's a separate issue that we don't have time to go into today, but I've provided some links here if this is something that you're interested in about interpreting meta-analyses. John Hattie has done some very popular work around meta-analyzing meta-analyses. So he combines different reviews of the literature and puts them together in what sometimes are called mega-analyses. And you may have seen some of the graphics that come out of this. So effect sizes across multiple different meta-analyses in for different areas of instruction. And he estimates that 0.4, an effect size of 0.4 is kind of a floor level or a minimum criteria to identify a practice as being effective. And so these are just some of those practices, and there are links to look at his work. This is just a nice infographic that someone put together on some of the more prominent practices and their effect sizes across multiple different meta-analyses that Hattie has analyzed in his work with he and his colleagues. So real quick, whenever I talk about evidence-based practices, I want to also emphasize what they are not. They're not a panacea. They are not a magic cure. They're not universally effective. There are non-responders to every practice, including evidence-based practices. I am not claiming, no one should be claiming that any particular practice, even those supported by multiple high-quality experimental research studies, works for everybody. Nothing works for everybody. I like to talk about, even though nothing is a guarantee, I'd much rather make a bet on the learning of my students that I'd much rather make a bet on a practice that is 90+% likely to pay off rather than make a 50-50 bet or just kind of hope that something works. I think that's important to think about. Evidence-based practices are not a guarantee. They're just a really good place to start with a practice that is highly likely to be effective. Evidence-based practices aren't perfect indicators of effectiveness. We have limited research. Research is imperfect and potentially biased. Research is trying to do as good a job as we can of estimating the effectiveness of practices, but it's still an estimate. And so we can't get, I think we would be foolish to think that research is a perfect indicator of effectiveness. And we have to take all research with a grain of salt. It's a very good estimate of effectiveness, but real world effectiveness is a very complex, nuanced issue. And identifying evidence-based practices is kind of a simple answer to a complex question. It is very nice to have a clear-cut answer. Are there multiple high-quality experimental studies to support a practice as effective? But it's not the same as actually knowing whether a practice is effective, especially for any individual group of students or for any individual student. Related to that, evidence-based practices and their effectiveness is not always generalizable. So some of the practices that I've shared with you here today, they've been shown by multiple high-quality studies to work, for example, with students with adolescents with autism in the US. That doesn't mean that they're going to work for a group of elementary students without disabilities in Greece. I think in general, effective practices are often robust. They work, if they're highly effective, they'll probably be effective with lots of different groups of learners, but there's no guarantee of that. And we'll talk a little bit about that as the last thing we talk about. Evidence-based practices don't implement themselves on their own. I've focused primarily on what EBPs are, how they're identified. In some ways, that's the easy part. The hard part is actually adopting them in schools, adopting them in effective ways and sustaining their implementation. That can be real hard. A lot of these evidence-based practices are complex interventions that require lots of training and resources that we don't always have. Change for schools, for classrooms, for individuals, it's hard to change things, and we need supports to do that. and I'll talk about that at the very end of the presentation. Last thought on what evidence-based practices are not. I don't want to suggest that we should boil down teaching, effective teaching, to the use of evidence-based practices. Evidence-based practices should be a tool for good teachers to use that will make good teachers that much more effective, because they're starting from a place of a generally highly effective practice. That's a great starting point. But if for someone who isn't a good teacher, you can give them an EBP and they won't be effective. These still need to be implemented via effective teaching practices. We still have to match practices to our learners. We still have to do these high leverage core teaching good practices. But what we teach, ideally, I think, should be informed by high quality research evidence on what are the most effective practices. And so this is a tool for researchers. This isn't meant to replace the skill and the craft of good teachers. It's meant to complement that. So I'll end with a brief section on how we can use evidence-based practices to engage in effective, high-quality teaching. So this is just one model that I've adapted for how we can go about effective instruction that is informed by research-based, evidence-based practices, and that's that bolded step. And so I'll talk about each of these steps briefly to conclude the talk. So first, we need to have a practical question. What do we want to improve? What are my students as a whole, or what are particular students not doing well in? Where do they need something more or something different to be done? And so we probably want to prioritize pivotal skills for the students, such as reading and behavior, but obviously we cover a lot of different areas in education. So first we need to know, what do I want to prioritize? What area do I want a new instructional practice to use? So then I'm going to search for relevant practices, and I can get ideas from journals, from textbooks, from administrators and colleagues and professional websites. Be careful about what's on the website. Be skeptical of everything. Be skeptical of what I'm saying. But the internet is a wonderful tool, but it can be a double-edged sword in that there's a lot of invalid information out there. But look broadly for different practices that are recommended to you, especially from more trusted sites, trusted sources. And then the next step, once you have some ideas about what practices that you're interested in, you appraise those identified practices. And this is really the part of this process of changing and improving one's teaching that is related to the evidence-based practices that I've been talking about today. So of those practices, are there evidence-based practices? Can you find an independent review, something on What Works Clearinghouse? Can you find a reliable review that suggests that the practice is evidence-based? If so, there's my thumbs up emoji. You're set. Evidence-based practices are a semi-formal, high bar, a rigorous criteria for estimating the effectiveness of a practice. You can have a lot of confidence in the general effectiveness of a practice if it's been formally identified as an evidence-based practice. If you've searched the different sources of evidence-based practices, you don't find one that's relevant for you, that is evidence-based, then we want to go to the best available evidence. And do we find evidence that there's at least some research to support it? Is it listed somewhere as a promising practice? Can we find a meta-analysis or a systematic review that supports the effectiveness of a practice? That's great. As I mentioned before, we don't have enough evidence-based practices identified right now. Hopefully 10, 20 years down the road, we're going to have more evidence-based practices identified, and we'll be able to rely more on identified evidence-based practice. But now, hopefully we find one for our area of need. But if we don't, then we go and we try to find practices that are identified by at least some reliable evidence. If we can't find reviews or meta-analyses or sources that have identified the practices as research-based or promising practices, we can look to individual studies. We can even look at practice-based evidence, such as the performance of students in other classes and talking to trusted colleagues, but realize that those single studies, information from colleagues can be very rich, but also has limitations. And so we want to prioritize, or the thinking from an evidence-based standpoint is to prioritize those practices with more rigorous research support. You also have to balance that research evidence by the fit of the practice. And so there can be an evidence-based practice, but it's shown to be evidence-based for kids of different ages, in different settings than what you teach in, that it requires too many resources and too much time. You don't have the training in it. And so just because a practice is evidence-based doesn't mean that you should necessarily use it. It also has to fit your circumstance and align with the needs of your students. This is a tool that our colleague Melinda Lico came up with, that there's a link there to the article, just different considerations to think about in addition to the strength of evidence. Things like how much it costs, how easy it is to implement, how many supports are provided to implement the practice, different things that you can consider and even rate to make a decision over whether you want to try this practice. And then once you decide on a practice, we need to implement it effectively and with fidelity. And the two things that stand out to me, there is a whole literature on these core effective instructional practices. These can be some of those high leverage practices. We need to use pacing that's appropriate. We need to teach with enthusiasm. We need to engage in frequent formative assessment. And we need to, just because it's evidence-based, if we do a bad job of teaching it, it won't be effective. So we need to use good, effective teaching practices when we implement an evidence-based practice. And then we also should implement it with fidelity. And so if I'm cooking something and I'm not a good cook, so I follow recipes. And if I deviate from that recipe, if I use different ingredients, if I don't cook a meal long enough, I can't really say, well, the recipe was wrong. That was no good. I didn't follow the steps. I didn't do it for long enough. And the same thing applies for evidence-based practices. If you don't follow the right steps, if you don't engage in the practice for long enough, you're unlikely to get the benefits that were documented in the research studies. As I mentioned, even when you engage in an evidence-based practice and do it and implement it with fidelity, it still isn't guaranteed to work for everyone. It is highly likely to work. And so we should be engaging in frequent formative assessment. One way to do that is through progress monitoring, but we should track students' performance across time. And if they aren't making progress, then we need to do something different. We shouldn't be engaging in a practice, even if it's evidence-based, if it's not resulting in improved student learning. But if it is, if we do have then data to show that a practice is working, we're good. We just keep doing it. We can also monitor fidelity. And so we can self-monitor fidelity, or we can have someone else come in and observe us. And are we engaging in all the different elements of an evidence-based practice? Because if we're not, that might be an explanation of why a practice isn't working as we might expect it to. And then I think this is the last thing I have. In the evidence-based movement, there is a lot of focus appropriately placed on fidelity, that we need to follow the critical elements. We need to follow the recipe. We need to engage in a practice how it is designed. And I think that's true, especially when we start using a practice. If we use different ingredients, if we don't cook it for too long, or we cook it too long, we can't expect the meal to be good. But I'm also an advocate for adapting practices. Once you've used a practice, once you are comfortable with a practice, once you understand a practice, master chefs don't just follow recipes. I can follow a recipe really good. It doesn't turn out like a master chef cooked something. Master chefs adapt and they tweak the ingredients. They're still cooking that dish, but they're making it their own, and they're making it work for them in certain ways. And they're adjusting to maybe this oven runs hot. Maybe this spice wasn't as spicy as they thought. So they're tasting it as they go. They're monitoring progress, and they're adjusting different elements as they go. And I think that's what real good teachers do too. And so don't be afraid to adapt. We just don't want to adapt so much that we're not engaging in the evidence-based practice anymore, because then we can't expect the benefits that have been documented in research. I'm not going to read them, but here's some guidelines that you can look over again from our colleague Melinda Lico about adapting evidence-based practices. And then finally, especially for students with disabilities who are often non-responders, but as I've mentioned a few times now, no practice works for everyone. So we can do all of these things right. We can identify an evidence-based practice. We can implement it with fidelity. We can adapt it. But if we continue to have data that show that the student isn't making adequate progress, we need to do something more or something different. And so that's, I think, part of what teaching is. It's just persistence and being informed by the data. And we go back and we say, well, is there another practice I might consider? Should I change the intensity of the delivery of the practice, for example? And so this isn't necessarily just a one-time, I found an evidence-based practice, this is good. I might have to really adapt or even change practices for some particular students who are non-responders. Oh, and I thought I was done, but to finish up real quick, these things, as I mentioned before, evidence-based practices don't happen on their own. And so we have to be smart about this, realizing that change is difficult. One of the sayings I like, we need to make it happen, not just hope that it happens. And so effective training for school leaders, providing effective training, providing ongoing coaching. So not just listening to someone come in and talk for 1 hour, but getting someone to engage over time and consistently with teachers to model these practices, to observe, to provide feedback, to do good coaching, to provide the resources, to support a school climate that encourages innovation and adoption of evidence-based practices. And one of the things that I really encourage people, if you have an evidence-based practice that you've used, create some good practice-based evidence about that. Teachers can be very convincing to other teachers. So talk to other teachers about how you've used evidence-based practices, how you've adapted evidence-based practices. And I think, honestly, I don't think meta-analyses and some of the things that I've talked about are convincing to a lot of teachers, but other teachers documenting and telling their success stories can be very convincing and can change hearts and minds. And so developing this practice-based evidence around evidence-based practice can be very effective and can help broaden the use of evidence-based practices. So that's just a little bit more on practice-based evidence. And so in conclusion, evidence-based practices, generally effective, shown by research to be generally effective based on multiple high-quality experimental studies. They're not a guarantee, they're not a panacea, they're not magic, but they're a nice place to start as one step in the larger process of effective evidence-informed teaching. Thank you very much, especially to my translator. I think I talked faster as I went. Hopefully I wasn't too challenging to keep up with. And I would very much welcome your thoughts and your questions.
Εμείς ευχαριστούμε τον κύριο Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Cook, and apologies. That we couldn't welcome you at the beginning due to technical reasons. Thank you very much. And we would like to thank Dimitris Anastasiou, who's been supporting the Federation since last year. We welcome him to this meeting. Dimitris, you have the floor.
Professor Ryan, thank you so much for your engaging and wonderful presentation. Your insights were truly valuable. We are grateful for the knowledge and inspiration you shared with us. I think we couldn't have asked for a more engaging and informative speaker in the area of evidence-based practices. We have some questions. I will try to classify and group them and ask them in a bunch. There are some questions to clarify things, and some of them were formulated during your presentation. So you may have covered some of these points, but it's a democratic tradition in the Union of Teachers not to silence any questions, so I have to ask them.
Sure.
First question, where can we find evidence-based practices? Similar question is, could Professor Cook possibly recommend some source of evidence-based practices for teaching English as a foreign language to kindergarten kids, 4 to 5 year olds that belong to the autism spectrum? And there is a similar one about is there research on preschool education that turns out to be evidence-based practice? These are the first three questions.
Those are all excellent questions. And I'm afraid I will provide disappointing answers. So the first question about where sources of evidence-based practices, I hope I provided some. I wasn't exhaustive about that. And I think there are many other articles in journals that review, that apply evidence-based standards, and in many cases identify evidence-based practices. As a partial answer to that and to the other questions, I personally don't know evidence-based practices for teaching English as a second language to young children with autism. But I would encourage you to look at those sources that I talked about. Autism in particular is an area that a lot of evidence-based practices have been identified around, and see if some of those practices can be incorporated into your instruction. As I mentioned, my hope is in 10, 20 years down the line, we are going to have a much more systematic approach to evidence-based practices. But these are great examples of, we only have so much research, and only so much research has been synthesized or reviewed. We just don't have evidence-based practices for every situation. And so these would be examples where going and looking for promising practices, for meta-analyses, for reviews, and perhaps even for just individually looking up different research studies to see what research has found as effective for different specific areas. And I know that's not it's not the answer people were hoping for with this is the practice that you should use, but I think trying to use those principles to inform your decision-making and try to find practices with the best, supported by the best available evidence is probably the way to go.
Thank you very much. Some other questions are about extensions of you have already covered. There is a question: should the choice of a teaching practice, mainly in special education, be based on the interest and needs of the students to bring about positive results?
Yes, and it's a great question, and I think it is an important point that oftentimes I think evidence-based approaches, there is a reaction to evidence-based approaches where educators feel like being told what to do, and that research evidence is the only or the main consideration. And so that's at the end, I try of the presentation, I tried to emphasize that research evidence should be one consideration in your toolbox. But yes, it should match the needs of the learners. It should match your resources and your skills as a teacher. Don't implement something that you find on a website as identified as evidence-based if that doesn't meet the needs and interests of and goals of your students. If that doesn't, if you aren't able to, you don't have the resources or background to implement that practice effectively, then don't do it. And research evidence is just one of many things that I think an effective teacher is thinking about and is using to inform their instructional decisions. And so these other points are very important to consider. I think it's just important that historically, we really haven't considered research evidence. And so sometimes we kind of fool ourselves into thinking that something looks very attractive or sounds like it should be really effective. And so one of the many things that teachers should be thinking about is there high quality research evidence to support this practice as well? It clearly isn't. It should not be the only consideration, but it should be one consideration that we're making. And just like the question posed, there's lots of things around that fit area that we have to make sure that there is a good fit for anything that we do for our students, for our classrooms, for ourselves, or it won't be effective. And so those are, teaching is a hard job. There are lots of things to think about. And I think one of the really challenging things about this is that around evidence-based practice is that we need to consider, or the hope is that we consider research evidence when we're making decisions about what and how to teach students. But as someone who is, as a professor who has focused on this for many, many years, it is hard to make those decisions. It is very difficult and requires advanced training to critically evaluate and synthesize research evidence. And that is the appeal of evidence-based practices, that if we have evidence-based reviews, if we have a good meta-analysis on a topic, someone with that special training and that background has done all of this for you, and they can something identified that's been published in a journal or is identified as an evidence-based practice by a professional organization. You can have a lot of faith that that practice is generally effective, that's a good kind of starting place in a particular area. But when you don't have those evidence-based practices identified, you still want to be informed by research. It gets messier to go out into the research on your own. It doesn't make it impossible, but I think it is an area maybe to look for collaborators with school leaders that do have these backgrounds, to work with local universities and to try to have someone with the research skills to critically evaluate the research evidence, to find practices that are supported by evidence, but also have good fit for your school and your classrooms and your students.
Thank you. The questions are coming in torrents, and I don't know if I'm able to ask all of them and translate at the same time and ask you. Okay, we have two questions about autism spectrum disorders and dyslexia. The first refers to dyslexia. What is the common practice for dealing with students with dyslexia? Is there a program in place, a recovery program, evidence-based program, I guess? Do teachers learn learn this program when they are at the university, or do they discover this on their own? This is one question for dyslexia. And there is another question about children with autism. Children with ASD often have a special interest. We use this in teaching, but to what extent? How should we expand this?
So, two big questions. The dyslexia question, this is an area in the US that has been a huge issue for many decades, and recently has taken some interesting turns. My take on the research evidence is that it favors phonics-based instruction, and many of those, or at least some of those evidence-based programs from the What Works Clearinghouse, excuse me, are about that, different programs that have been shown to be effective using a phonics-based approach for young readers and teaching them how to read. Where this is taught or where teachers learn this, it depends. I think there are some very good teacher preparation programs that do that. By and large, my view is that teacher preparations in the States don't do a great job of doing that. And so there's different levels at which I think this is an area where the research to practice gap exists. And so we still see lots of a more whole language approach to teaching reading being used, which can be effective in some ways, but for teaching kids, especially struggling readers, how to learn, there's more and more evidence that a phonics-based approach is effective, and yet not all teachers are trained in that. And there are differing opinions on this. I think this gets a lot of attention because it's such a high stakes area, teaching young kids how to read. One of, if not the most important skill that we teach children as educators. And there's just lots of different thoughts on this. I think it's a great case study in a way about how much research evidence is considered when making these decisions. There is, in the States, there is a movement just in the last couple of years that has been called the science of reading, that is really trying to emphasize, it's very consistent with the evidence-based practice approach of emphasizing what does the research say. Let's be informed in our instructions about how to teach reading by what the research says. And it is a ongoing debate as we speak. I would think that there would be some translated versions available, although I don't know that. But Emily Hanford is a journalist who has really covered this debate around reading and the science of reading. And she recently has come out with a podcast that has been very popular in the States called Sold a Story. For those of you who are interested in this debate, it is actually, I think, very instructive in terms of thinking about how research can be and oftentimes is not used to inform teaching practice. It is focused in the United States, but I think the general points would adhere to schools anywhere. With autism is not my area of expertise. I don't want to speak in an area that I'm not well versed in the research on it, and so I am aware to some degree, and I think this is maybe an area where evidence-based practices are important, but aren't the whole story. That we still have to do what is ethically right. With autism, for students that have perseverative skills or perseverative behavior, where they're engaging in these kind of splinter tasks or skills, and that they do a lot of repetition and in a particular area and like that. I think that can be used potentially in one's education or in one's instruction of students with autism. I know that there is a growing movement around neurodiversity to, I think in the past, there were oftentimes efforts to try to restrict students from engaging in certain behaviors that are just part of who they are as an individual with autism. And I think, sorry, my screen, something happened, but I don't think I got cut off. That we want to respect people's who they are and what they want to do, and try to set them up for success in life, and teach them skills that they need to be successful, but also respect neurodiversity and let them engage in behaviors and let them follow the dreams and goals and involve self-determination as much as possible. But again, I don't want to speak too much to specific practices there, because it's really not my area per se.
Okay, there are other two questions about if, in your experience, can good practices, I guess that we can translate this in evidence-based practices in special education, can these practices contribute to general education? And there is another one. Does the learner's profile determine the intervention and best practice protocols? And if so, who is the person who does that?
Can you repeat that last one for me, Dimitris?
The last one?
Yes.
Does the learner's profile determine the intervention? If the learner's profile has an impact on what intervention we choose, and if there is a protocol about it.
So learners helping to choose which practices?
Not the learners. Apparently, the teachers pick up the intervention, but if the learner profile play a role.
Oh, learner profile. Yes.
The intervention.
Okay, gotcha.
And
so,
if there is a protocol about it, if there is, what is the best protocol about it?
So the question about general education, does this apply to general education? Now, my background is special education. I used to teach kids with disabilities, and that's been academically where I do my work. And I do think evidence-based practice has a stronger foundation in special education. I think in some ways, our students there is a stronger need, a more pressing need to very often students with disabilities, their performance profile, they need to catch up to meet their goals. They really need to accelerate their learning. And so the use of highly effective evidence-based practice seems to make a lot of sense for students with disabilities. I would argue that that very much applies for students without disabilities as well, that we would want to use the most effective practices for everyone. And from my training, my background, I think the most valid way, the way that I would be most confident in knowing that a practice works, is to have high quality experimental research, multiple high quality experimental studies showing that a practice works. And I think that applies to general education as well. I think the caveat is that the same practice that works, there may be some different evidence-based practices. There may be some interactions between interventions and learner characteristics. And so just because we've identified, for example, a practice as being effective for students with autism, it might not be effective for students without autism, and it might not be relevant for students without autism because they may have different learning goals and needs. And so that goes back to our discussion about fit and looking at the learner profile. Just because a practice is found to be evidence-based for one group of learners doesn't necessarily make it relevant or evidence-based for another group of learners. And so that we would want to know whether a practice is evidence-based for a general education population before we use it. In terms of, excuse me, get a drink. And then the question about the learner profile, at least as I was interpreting it, yes, that's a key element of fit, and that considering the student's learning profile and what the student needs, one, that's going to direct what type of practice we're looking for. We don't want to implement a practice just because it's evidence-based. If so we have an evidence-based practice to improve a student's behavior, but a particular student may not be having behavioral issues, and so we don't need to use it for that student. That this student, perhaps a practice is evidence-based and it relies on recognition from adults, but we know this student doesn't respond well to attention from adults. And so, yes, we should have all of those things in mind and be looking for a high level of fit and think about the profile of our learners as a whole in our school or our class, but also to the degree that it's possible for individual learners and seeing what practices make the most sense for them. And I think this is an area where sometimes, and I don't know how this will translate, but in the States, oftentimes I hear debates about whether teaching is a science or an art. And I think it's some of both. And so this is some of, we should inform that idea that I really like about using research findings as a tool, but we still have to be smart practitioners and use our skill and wisdom as practitioners to get that fit or that match between practices and individual learner profiles. I did provide a link, and there was that Melinda Lico has developed that one kind of, I don't know if I'd call it a protocol per se, but it is that where that is taken from, and there is a link in my slides to that article. That whole article is about selecting and adapting evidence-based practices. So that would be a good resource to consider for that.
Thank you, Brian. There is another question. There are many questions, but I may prioritize one because it reflects dissenting voice, and the Federal Union Teachers is open to these multiple perspectives. It has a comment in the beginning, and at the end there are two questions. I start translating the comment. In my opinion, the problems of the education of students with disabilities cannot be solved by focusing on evidence-based teaching practices and the empiricist positive methodology that supports them. What is required is the transition to scientific concepts that can claim universal validity, with the passage from the focus on experience, that is what in science and philosophy is called empiricism or positive, to the development of concepts such as the concepts of appropriation and zone of proximal development developed in the Soviet Union from cultural historical theory, or as the concept, another concept developed by German pedagogy, isolation from the historical heritage of mankind. So the questions are the following. On what philosophical and scientific assumptions is based the concept of validation, says, or good practice? And the second question, can the special education teachers solve the problems of the education of students with disabilities by sticking to the empirical data and ignoring all the philosophical and epistemological development that took place in the 20th century?
Excellent questions. There is an ongoing debate in education and evidence-based education around the role of theory. And there are some standards that posit that there has to be or one of the criteria for an evidence-based practice, that it has to have, it has to be theoretically supported. So some people would argue that. Others, and I think I would fall into this camp, would say, although theory is critically important for understanding the broader picture and developing kind of grand theories for teaching, evidence-based practice is a more specific niche or a more specific issue around what do we have evidence for that works. I think it should work ideally in concert with theory and different epistemological traditions, but its unique focus is looking at how do we is the unique focus of research evidence as the basis for evidence-based practice is simply identifying, is there reliable research to support a particular practice as effective? It is a limited question. And I don't think, as the question and the comment suggest, it is not going to solve all of our problems. And I try to emphasize that when I talk, that this is one tool that we can use in addition to thinking about theory, to thinking about broader societal issues and lots of other issues that certainly impact education and student learning. So in terms of kind of the epistemological foundations of evidence-based practice, I think about them as being a positivist, perhaps a post-positivist, empirical foundation that this very specific role that I'm talking about to try to inform, but not be the only consideration, but to inform education, is focusing on what does the best available empirical evidence say about practices. This isn't probably going to result in, but perhaps can inform, but it isn't probably going to result in grand theories about how to instruct. It's meant to provide very practical answers to what evidence do we have that a particular practice results in improved student learning outcomes. And I think that is a relevant, but perhaps limited issue within that we can take into consideration when thinking about education. I hope that addresses the issue, which I do think is an important one. And I do want to communicate that as much as I've put a lot of thought into evidence-based practice, and it is a big focus in the states right now, especially from the federal government's perspective and trying to really push the use of evidence. It isn't everything, and it shouldn't be thought of as everything, but it tries to answer that one specific question of what do we know, what reliable evidence do we have about the effectiveness of specific practices, which should not take the place of these broader questions around education and learning in society.
Thank you very much, Brian. I don't think we have so much time, but there are 3 questions remaining. The 2 of them have to do with the inclusive education and co-teaching. The first question is about inclusion. Implementation of inclusive education requires deep knowledge. What does this presuppose at the level of society and the state? I don't know if this relates closely to your presentation. And there is another related question. Is there anything similar to parallel support? Parallel support is the model of co-teaching implemented in Greece. Is there anything similar to parallel support translated in co-teaching in American schools? If so, how does this work? Does this work as one-on-one teacher or as a second teacher of a group of a second teacher, a co-teacher in the class, or even in the whole class? Because in Greek schools, there is an increase in identification of students with disabilities that need parallel support. And in many cases, the special education teacher acts as assistant in the classroom. I don't know if you want to answer these questions.
Sure. Well, I'll try anyway. We'll see it. We'll see how well I do. So the inclusion question is an important one, and I do think it's a good example of how evidence-based practices perhaps can be helpful. I think providing background in to general educators, to others involved in inclusive education, to be using generally effective practices is going to be helpful and can facilitate inclusion. But as the person who posed the question mentioned, inclusion is about a lot more than just specific practices. It I think reflects or involves values and attitudes and demands considerable resources. And so it does go beyond just the use of practice of evidence-based practice. And it's a good example of a bigger issue. We can't really talk about inclusion being an evidence-based practice or not, because there are so many ways that inclusion can be done. And I've personally been involved with and seen inclusion work very well. And I've been involved in situations where inclusion doesn't work particularly well. And so it's a bigger issue that I think is going to necessitate a lot of work with schools, with teacher preparation, to try to make it work as best as possible. That I think probably involves evidence-based practice, but goes far beyond that. In terms of co-teaching is a big issue in the US. I've done some work around co-teaching. I have my wife and other colleagues have done a lot more. I think co-teaching co-teaching received a lot of attention in the US as inclusion became more and more popular. It became a popular approach to try to make inclusion happen. Not unlike inclusion, I've seen co-teaching where it works really well. And I've seen co-teaching where it doesn't work well at all. And so again, I think co-teaching, because it can be done many different ways, we really can't talk about whether it's evidence-based or not, because there are so many different models. The person asking the question mentioned that a lot of time the special educator ends up kind of being assistant in the class in co-teaching models. We see that a lot in US schools as well. The observational research that exists on it shows that clearly that is the primary way that co-teaching plays out. And that's a shame, because you have a specially trained teacher who is kind of sitting by and helping maybe a couple of students with disabilities in the classroom and functioning much like an aide. I guess personally, I think co-teaching under ideal circumstances, when using more of a truly collaborative model, can be helpful and effective. But as it is often used, it isn't always effective. And I don't think we should assume that because a classroom is co-taught, that it is necessarily going to be effective for all learners in that classroom.
Okay, the last two questions concerning the evaluation of teachers. At this moment we speak, there is the Greek Minister of Education applies system of accountability in which schools are evaluated, and at the current phase also the Ministry of Education tries to evaluate the teachers at individual basis as well. So there are two questions. If a teaching is unique, what can an external evaluator can do with this? And another question, the last one, the effects that the evaluation of teachers will have on their work and their working situation.
Those are big educational policy questions that I'll just touch on and give you my thoughts with the caveat that that's not my area of expertise either. So just a couple of thoughts for whatever they're worth. Yeah, this issue of accountability, teacher accountability and evaluation is a huge one, and how that plays out in special education is very interesting. In the States, we've gone through a period of federal legislation where we saw a real emphasis in trying to evaluate teachers and hold schools especially, but to some degree teachers accountable for the learning of their students, and at times would use fairly sophisticated algorithms or formulas to try to estimate teacher effectiveness based on the tested outcomes of students. How that plays out for students with disabilities who just learn at different and individualized rates, I think that makes it very difficult. And I think that holds true for all students. Kids just learn at different rates, and it's very difficult to hold a teacher, or problematic to hold teachers accountable or evaluate teachers based on that. So I think we're starting to see in the States maybe a return to more of an observational approach, where there are different approaches for observing teachers and their use of high leverage practices, evidence-based practices in their teaching, and using that as an evaluation. Teacher accountability and evaluation, I think it's an important area where teachers are professionals, and we should be accountable for engaging in professional practice, but it is really hard to figure out how to do that in a meaningful, responsible way. And the last question about the effects of this on teachers, I think is one of the things to consider around all of this. And to do this in a way that is respectful, that is encouraging, that isn't punitive. I don't know what it's like in Greece, but we in the States are facing some teacher shortages, especially in special education, especially coming up. I think we're probably still in the pandemic, but hopefully at the latter stages of the pandemic. But there are shortages of teachers, and teaching conditions are difficult. Pay isn't fantastic, and so to add on top of that these sometimes punitive systems of accountability and evaluation, I think doesn't help to encourage people to go into the profession of teaching. And I like the idea. I don't know in Greece if this is popular or how it's being framed, but in the US in the past 10 to 15 years, what we refer to as multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS.
There was a question, I forgot to ask this question. Okay. The question is if we can apply a multi-tier system of support in Greece. Okay, but
and so the idea of, and maybe I can work this into my response here, that with multi-tiered systems of supports, that in some ways it's just a different framing for how we organize supports, and maybe that includes supports for students with disabilities to some degree too, where everybody gets core, high quality, evidence-based instruction. But that's not going to work for everybody. And so we do ongoing formative assessment. And for students who we have good data-based reasons to know that they aren't making adequate progress, we give them more intensive, more targeted instruction around evidence-based practices. That's going to work for most kids, but there's still going to be a very small proportion of kids, even getting good core instruction and good targeted and additional targeted instruction, they're going to need some truly individualized instruction. And so that is, usually this is conceptualized as a 3-tier model, so that individualized instruction would occur at the 3rd level. There's, like anything, it is hard to argue conceptually with MTSS. I personally, I think it makes sense in terms of a way to think about trying to based on student performance data, give students more intensive and individualized instruction when they need it to be successful. But like many things, it is difficult to actually implement. There's a lot of parts to it. The research that we have on it is mixed in terms of its overall effectiveness. So can that happen in Greece? I don't know. Can it happen in the US? I don't know. I mean, it can happen. Can it happen effectively? I think is the question. And there are lots of issues, and that's a whole other topic. I was going to introduce that topic to talk about thinking about evaluating and training teachers, that I think that general approach, I've seen some very interesting proposals and discussions about, rather than a more kind of punitive model for evaluating teachers, to engage in observations and training of teachers using an MTSS model like we do when we think of students. And some teachers we're going to give everybody some good supports and some good training. For a lot of teachers, that's all they're going to need to take off and engage in evidence-based practice and to do some good high quality teaching. Other teachers, maybe especially beginning teachers, are going to need some more ongoing targeted intervention to help them in certain areas. And we're going to do observations and collect data on that. And then that's going to take care of a lot more teachers at kind of a level 2 approach. But for some teachers, they're going to need even more supports to be really effective. And I like the kind of positive emphasis on providing more supports to teachers who need it to be effective with their students, supporting teachers at different levels of intensity rather than evaluating in a more punitive way to try to weed out ineffective teachers in some ways.
Thank you very much. I have to say that it was a pleasure to have you with us, and we hope you enjoyed this long discussion experience as much as we did. Again, thank you for your time and for your sharing your expertise with us. Thank you, Brian.
Oh, thank you. I was glad to, and I'm honored to be asked to come and talk with you. I hope some of it you find it useful, and yeah, I appreciated the time.
Δημήτρη, θα προχωρήσεις, θα κάνεις κάποιο σχόλιο άλλο?
No, I'm okay. Είμαι εντάξει εγώ.
Ωραία. Εγώ θα ήθελα λοιπόν να ευχαριστήσω για μια...
So I would like to thank on behalf of the Greek Primary Teachers Federation, Mr. Cook, for this public discussion, especially on special education. I have heard his comment about the substaffing of schools, and in Greece, special education are downgraded as well. We have this parallel support model, which is less scientifically substantiated. I also say I would like to thank Mr. Anastasiou, who did not mention a lot of his background. He has written a wonderful article for the Greek primary teaching. Public debate we have chosen to open in the framework of the fight against a unidimensional assessment is an ongoing process. The scientific point of view is our ally, and I would like to thank Mr. Cook once again. We will continue next week. We have another event. It will be at noon because we will have speakers from Melbourne and who will be here to share their experience. It is quite important, not only for us here in Greece, but for the whole educational community. I would like to thank all participants. It would be a pleasure to have so prominent guests. I wish you a good evening. Thank you very much.